from the jump. She told me 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 from the jump. Walk 100 miles in my shoes, bet you can't. Take 10 steps with a God, bet you faint.
Welcome back to the Simple Questions Podcast. I'm your host, Dylan Carnahan. Today's episode is called What Makes a Good Beer? But before we get into that, you probably noticed that the intro was a little bit different this time around. I'm going to try something new where each intro is going to feature a local artist from the area. This episode's song is Jump by BlckSamson. That's BlckSamson, all one word. BlckSamson, also known as Brandon Williams, is a friend and teammate of mine, so make sure to give him a listen. I'll have a link to his iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud in the show notes below this episode. And if you or anyone you know that is an artist in the area wants to be on the podcast, send me a DM on any of the numerous Simple Questions podcast social media accounts, whether that be Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or visit the website and shoot me an email, and we'll show you some Simple Questions love. And in the off chance that no one does submit anything, I will become a local artist myself and I will begin singing, but I'd rather not do that because I think that'll be less listener friendly. But you never know, maybe you guys are into Gregorian chant, which is the only thing I got on my sleeve. So alright, now that we got that out of the way, let's get into today's episode. What makes a good beer? Hopefully after listening to this episode, you're gonna gain a little bit of an understanding and maybe be able to answer that question for yourself, as well as you're gonna hear a story of one of our own from the area. And who doesn't want to learn more about beer or talk about beer? So go grab a cold one, sit back and listen to the podcast. And if you're at work, it's fine. Just tell your boss I said it's okay. They should allow it. Our guest, I've known him for several years and had the privilege of working with him. He's won several home brew awards, and now he is the co-founder and brewmaster of Red Crow Brewing Company, located in Olathe, Kansas, off of Parker and Santa Fe, and his name is Chris Roberts.
That's why I stayed. She told me what it was from the jump. She told me what it was from the jump. She told me what she want from the jump. Said she told me from the jump. She told me from the jump.
All right, Chris, you're gonna have to give me a little bit of a hall pass here. It's my first interview and I'm a little nervous. Okay, so let's just jump into it and start off with, how did you start your voyage into craft beer? What was kind of the catalyst that got you into that?
This is it's kind of like a little bit of a lengthy answer. So anyway, I kind of started, like, I used to never drink. Like when I was like the good kid in high school, like all my friends were going out to parties and stuff and getting beer and getting liquored up. And I don't think I actually had anything to drink until I was a junior or senior. And then it was something weak, like, no, actually I remember exactly. It was Hot Damn and RC Cola that my neighbor, but I didn't really have like any beer until I got to college. And it was basically just like Bud Light, Coors Light. And then fast forward, I was 21. I got this job at a liquor store, and they had, you didn't have craft, quote unquote, at the time. Where we were, because I was going to college at Fort Hays State. And so basically all we had was like German beer, because if you didn't drink like the local stuff, that's all you had. One of the guys in their dorm when I was a freshman kind of turned me on to Amberbach by Michelob, and I was like, this is pretty good. But it was like $7 for a 6-pack instead of, I can get a 12-pack for $7.
Yeah, that price.
It's the price point.
Yeah. Would you say that kind of, I mean, I know obviously I worked at Red Crow, and that kind of shaped my like alcohol preferences. So that job at the liquor store, that kind of broadened your horizons a little bit.
Yeah, and so all we had, like, I worked at like a small like branch of this like the largest liquor store. It's called Kaiser's there in Hayes, and so they had a great big one, and then I worked at the small one, like in this small little strip mall. And so basically all we had was liquor, wine, and then it was pallets of Keystone Light, 30 packs, and then like Coors heavy bottles, and then we had some German stuff. And so like I started drinking like St. Pauli Girl in the green bottles, because I can't. Someone told me it was good, and I tried it, and I was like, that's not bad. And so that was like my splurge, was like St. Pauli Girl, not knowing that it was skunky. Because they had the green bottles, and it just sits in there, and the light just pounds on it all day long. So, but like my kind of voyage in the craft beer is, we moved when my wife Misty and I moved up here, and then like our first year we basically just, because we didn't have any money, we just basically drank like whatever was the cheapest thing we could find, just like here in college still. And then moved up here, bought a house, and then our local liquor store had like a door. It was like one door singles, and they had all this different stuff. And then I was like, oh man, Boulevard Wheat, that's everyone's jam around here. And I was like, oh, Boulevard Pale Ale, let's try that. And then after a few, you kind of get used to it. And then I was like, well, what's an IPA? It's India Pale Ale. I'm going to try that. And so I started actually drinking Red Hook IPA, which I think was like my kind of aha moment. Then they came out with this one called Longhammer, and I loved it. And so that's when we had like disposable income. That's what we drank. If not, it was like Bud Light or Miller Lite or Coors.
So how do you so you gain this kind of taste, right, for craft beer? It's kind of, you're amassing a little bit of knowledge, you're getting exposed to stuff. What's the transition to say, hey, I want to make this,
So the transition was, I'd worked in corrections for a while, and then it wasn't paying the bills. And it wasn't kind of panning out. My degree is in criminal justice.
Okay.
And I was trying to get a job as a cop. And so at one point I'm like, screw it. It's time to start paying off bills. It goes from the things you want to do to things you have to do. I end up getting a CDL and driving a truck for a living. So part of that, I got a job at Cisco Foods. One of our customers was 23rd Street Brewery there in Lawrence.
Okay.
So showed up one day. There's nobody there, but the door's unlocked. So I brought everything in, dropped it off. I kind of knew where it went. Nobody's there. I'm calling my buddy who's their normal driver. I'm like, hey, man, what do I do? And he's like, oh, do you see this car in the parking lot? I'm like, yeah. He's like, oh, he's just getting cigarettes at Hy-Vee. He'll be there in a minute. I was like, okay. So apparently this guy was just kind of jacking around or whatever. And so I went ahead and gave myself a self-guided tour of the brewery. I was like, oh man, this stuff is cool. And basically from there, I went home and started kind of looking into stuff. Like before I changed my major to criminal justice, I actually went to college to be an engineer. So I'd always loved like building stuff. And I get a lot of satisfaction in doing my own thing.
Putting something out there that's yours.
Yeah. And whether it's, in my garage or whatever, like I'm kind of like that cheap bastard who, instead of actually going out and buying the thing that does X, I'm like, I figure out the way to make X work with all these other things. And half the time it looks atrocious.
Jerry-rigged.
Yeah. And that's the best way. Like I am a farm engineer by training. So I am the duct tape and bubble gum and JB Weld kind of a guy. Like our keg washer is basically 2x4s and wood screws, but it does pretty more. I'm actually getting ready to automate it. But I just like looking at things and figuring out how to make it work. And like, we didn't have a whole lot of money. And I think that was the biggest thing. It's like, I loved IPA, but I could literally get a 6-pack of IPA, or I can get like a 30-pack of Keystone Light kind of a thing. And so at that time it was like, the wife's gonna be mad if I come home with just a 6-pack. So I was like, and then at Cisco, we actually had our own grain. And so I could pretty much make 2 cases of beer for the price of buying a 6-pack.
Really?
And so
you saw that, you got that price benefit there.
Yeah. The cost of goods were super low. It's the end package, the end product is what costs the most. And so I ended up I am like, now I call myself the king of Craigslist, because I can always find something on Craigslist to use. Like my wife's uncle used to work at Pepsi, and so he would get me, they're called Ball-Lock kegs, and they're designed like for like the little Wonder Bar thing that everyone uses like in a liquor store. That's what would go through. It was basically like concentrated syrup that would get mixed with water, and you get pop, soda fountain. And so he would like bring over like 20 of these things, and I would clean them up and I'd trade them to people for stuff.
So
Like,
you're turning the paperclip into a house on Craigslist, trying to get all this brewing
yes,
equipment.
that's essentially what it was. Yeah, like he gave me my first cooler that I used for a mash tun, and I think we'll probably get into that a little bit. Like I got like it was like an all sport mash tun. It was black and like lime green, and I built the manifold in the bottom, which separates the grain from the wort. And like I literally did like what's called extract, which is like a kit beer. It's like the easiest way to make beer.
Okay.
It's basically like it's like concentrated malt sugar. You put it in a pot, throw some hops in there, boil it, throw it in the fermenter, and then 2 weeks later, you may or may not have something you can.
So how did you find all this information? So obviously you've gained this exposure. You're kind of like, I have this knack, this engineering, like putting things together. Where do you go to, learn more about craft beer and be able to make it?
So the making part, like I just like Google, like, I don't even think you had Google at the time, but like with, Netscape Navigate to, I found this, it's called homebrewtalk.com. And it's just this massive forum of recipes and recipe development. And then just like, hey, this is what I do, and then started finding books. And they're like, okay, there's like a beginner's forum. It's like, these are the books you need.
Oh, wow. So you were able to kind of, through that website, they had kind of like a way for you to.
Yeah. Yeah, the HPT is fantastic. I mean, it's like a little community. And I don't participate in it so much now because it's so full of people. And with the way the internet goes now, it's like for every great person you meet on there, you meet 30. So, I mean, it's just like, it's the same thing. It's like Facebook now.
Okay.
And so and now I haven't been on it for a while. There's a couple columns on there that I do follow, like the automated brewing stuff, because I mean that, like I said, I originally went to college to be an engineer, and it was actually electrical engineering, and that stuff still piques my interest.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of that, like I have carryover here. Like I don't have the ability to sit down and write a program. Like I use a couple things like an Arduino, which is a small process board. Like I can't write my own code, but I know enough knowledge. I have enough knowledge in the ability to take that product and find a code similar to what I need and basically hack it and slash it and make it do what I need it to do. And so like I've got a couple little ones that I use for like a PID is this type of controller. So like, what a sous vide is, where you basically, it's like a crock pot with like a brain in it to where it'll keep the water in the crock pot at like exactly like 130 degrees, like plus or minus like a quarter of a degree.
Okay. I don't know what that is, but I get why that would be important for brewing.
Yeah. And so like I've got a couple of those little programs that these guys have made, and because it's open source, they typically will put their programs on the internet, and all you do is download them, and then you can use them at will because it's open source. It's not like if you took Microsoft.
Yeah, that pirated, that unlicensed 2010 Microsoft or Photoshop.
Yeah. You're not, if you use an Arduino, if you take someone's Arduino code and modify it, you're not going to federal prison.
Yeah.
So, there's a couple guys out there that are like kind of nerds like me, but like with a higher skill set. And there's a bunch of like programs that you can get to use. And, it's like basically it's open source. And so you don't have to pay any license fee unless you're like using it at a commercial scale. And so those things have always fascinated me. So like we're getting ready, we use a product called the BCS 460 from Embedded Concepts, and we're getting ready to actually add it to our brew system. Our brew system is very simple. And we use it right now to control our fermenters, and we're getting ready to add it to the hot side in order to just have an instant reference on, okay, this is what temperature the brewer is at. So I have an idea like when we're going to hit boil.
You have that added information that you're going to get.
Yeah, instead of like stopping what I'm doing and going over there and looking at it and like getting the thermometer out and waiting for it to come up to temperature, I can have instant access. Like I'm using the bathroom, I can pull it up on my phone and see exactly where we're at. I'm like, holy crap, it's getting ready to boil. Let's make sure that X, Y, and Z.
You're not going to have that constant observation. You're going to be able to monitor that, at home. It's going to open up a lot more of your time. So how long was the experience of brewing at home? Like obviously you have a brewery now, but
so yeah, I think so. So this Christmas would be 12 years I brewed my first beer.
Oh wow.
And so 12 years. So
Was it good?
2008.
Was the beer was the first batch good?
You know what? It wasn't horrible. It just wasn't a style that I cared for. And so what I ended up doing was getting like the least expensive kit they had to make. And so it ended up being like a Hefeweizen. And Hefeweizen is just not it's a German wheat beer. It's just not a style that I never really cared for it.
Was it made out of like your knowledge at the time, like that was the easiest thing to do, or
That was part of it, because like the thing with hops, they're the first thing to fade if you do things incorrectly, and so it can affect the more hops you have in a beer, the more difficult it ends up being to get a successful batch out of it, especially when you're looking at a homebrew scale, and all the other things that kind of go into it. You know, like with an extract kit, it's literally just dumping sugar, syrup into a pot.
okay.
And then boiling it and throwing some hops in there to bitter it. And then when you're done, you just dump it in a bucket and throw some yeast in it and put it in your closet for 2 weeks.
So that's just the most basic introductory thing.
Yes. That's the most generalized way you can do it. But then there's also a lot of things as far as chemistry that go along with it. Like if your water is, as a pH of 7.5, for example, and you put that in there and you put the malt extract in there and you throw your hops in there, well, that's not on a professional scale. We look at we want our pre-boil pH or our pre-hopping pH to be around 5.4, because above that you get a lot of like phenol extraction and you get a lot of additional bitterness extraction. The efficiency goes up, but it rips out of the hops these flavors that you don't want. So you get like soapy characteristics and you get really astringent and really sharp bitterness out of the hops. And those are things we don't want. I mean, you can literally there's processes that you can extract every single ounce of whatever's in those hops out, but that doesn't necessarily make for a higher quality product.
And as you're starting out, you're probably, you may not be checking the pH of your tap water and saying, this is Kansas hard rural tap water or whatever. You're probably just going in there and you're like, oh, this tastes,
Yeah.
It is how it is. It's the first batch. So
yeah. And honestly, the water that I used in our first batch is the base water that we use in every batch since then. The only difference is we adjust it using acid, either citric or lactic acid. We adjust the water pH down, and we also send it through what's called a granulated active carbon water filter system. And so what that is essentially it's coconut shells that are treated specifically to take out chlorine and chloramine. So the water companies have to, by law, make water stable for drinking. And so I think they add chlorine to it and ammonia at the station. I believe those are the two chemicals they add. But what those do is when they combine, they form a product called chloramine, which is essentially why, you're supposed to, like if you have goldfish or whatever, you're supposed to either get reverse osmosis water or treat it with these things are called Candem tabs.
Yeah.
And that,
because they can't really live there. It's not really.
Yeah, no. The chloramines are toxic to fish. So if you just took a guppy and threw it in some tap water, it's dead, after a bit. The same thing with brewing. If there's chloramine in the water, when you strike with it, when you add it to the grain, it actually produces a product called chlorophenols, which, when you were a kid and Band-Aids came in those really thick plastic, they were pink plastic, and then they were in the metal container.
Okay.
So that smell, like you can, like I say that, and I'm sure you can remember. You may be old enough. You're kind of a little surprised still. But remember, like the Band-Aid brand, they came in the little metal containers.
Yes, yeah. Like almost
you open them up,
Altoid kind of.
Yes. And so, like, can you remember that smell? So that if there's chloramine in your water when you do an all malt beer, you can actually get that same aroma.
Which is obviously not good when you're gonna
Yeah,
smell that and
no, when you
drink
want to
it.
drink it, you don't want your bunch of beer tasting like Band-Aids from when you were 8 years old. So, but it's weird. It's a weird thing. It's just like how it's like the metabolism of it, because there's some actual bacteria and some yeast that can actually mimic those same. They make it through a different pathway, but make that same. You can get it in sour beer as well. So certain guys, if you use an anaerobic bacteria, you can get those same chlorophenols by using the wrong sour yeast.
So it's 2008. You've made your 7 pH water. You put it in there. You got your Band-Aid smelly beer that you're not all that into. You keep at it, and how do you transition from that to, hey, I now have a brewery? How do you go from there to there? Like,
just kind of like the same thing, just kind of kept plugging along, and was anal retentive enough to kind of, it's like this, like the scientific method kind of a thing. It's like, conduct an experiment and then see how it turns out, and then figure out where you screwed up, and then try it again, and we actually started getting pretty lucky. Like we started learn some things, started using Camden tabs, then actually started just filtering the water, and it turned out pretty good. Ended up winning a few awards. I mean, nothing like major going forward. And then one day, it was Missy's, my wife's sister, at one point lived a block over from us. And so they were over at the house, and we were drinking some of my homebrew, and her parents were over at the house, and we were getting liquored up. And I think they were over for a birthday party or something. And Joe, my father-in-law, was like, I always wanted to have a brewery. He went through this big, long story about how there was this place in Junction City that was like right around the corner from where he used to work. And we're like, yeah, that's a great idea. And so like the next day, like I asked Missy, I was like, do you think Joe was serious? He's like, oh yeah. He's like, even before you started brewing, that was like something that he wanted.
oh, wow.
And so we were just kind of chit-chatting one time. I was like, are you serious about that? He's like, yeah, if you could figure out how we could do this. And that was kind of like the rise of like what they kind of called the nano brewery. And so like a couple guys, like I was all over homebrewtalk.com, and a couple guys are like, quote unquote, going pro. And basically what they were doing is they were making 1-barrel batches, which a barrel is like, been to a keg party. They're the full-size keg is a half barrel.
Oh, really?
They were basically,
That's
yeah,
half?
they were, and it's just, so the big kegs that we have, like the big metal ones, are half barrels. So they're 15.5 gallons. So a barrel is 31 gallons. And it's just an old kind of antiquated, like a lot of the stuff in brewing, like the terminology is just like throwback type terminology.
Okay, as that roots in like the history.
Yeah. Yeah. Like we still call it hot liquor, even though it's hot liquor is just hot water.
Okay.
Which I don't know. It's like in Kansas, liquor is anything that's not like cereal malt beverage. So wine is liquor, beer is liquor, liquor is liquor. It's the weirdest thing. It's just government, and you have certain rules that you have to abide by. But anyway, so there's a couple guys like certain states have different rules. Like there's a guy, two breweries I was following. One is Hess, and one other one, and they're in San Diego, and now they're pretty big. But that guy he was like a financial advisor or something. And he just, went through the application process, and the government doesn't tell you how big your brewery has to be. You just have certain other rules. It's mostly taxation that you have to follow. And so this guy basically just started making like 3 kegs at a time in the spot next to his financial advising firm. And then these guys out in Pennsylvania, I think it was called Breakside or something like a Breakaway. Their garage was detached from their house. And so they got their garage license as a brewery in Pennsylvania, and so they started making beer in their garage on the weekend and selling it to local beer bars, and just took off. And now they have like a great big tap room. So, we were looking at doing like the same thing.
I had a model to look up how to do that.
And then just doing like draft sales and then building from there. But, so we were kind of planning all these things, and we were going to do X, and we were going to do it out in Chapman, which is Missy's hometown, because property was pretty inexpensive. And we kind of hemmed haw around it and kind of like, drug our feet. And then I was looking, and Tallgrass had this thing. It was like How to Brew Day. And it was at their old location. And so we signed up for it. And it was supposed to be like all of us, because at the time when we were like, yeah, we're going to do this brewery, it was like Misty and I, and then Joe and Loretta. Those are my in-laws, and then it was Misty's brother and his wife, and then it was
There's more?
Melissa. Yeah. Oh, no.
The army.
So it was supposed to be like 8 of us.
Oh.
And we had signed up for this How to Brew Day thing, and no one else could make it except for Joe and I. And so we had these specific instructions. It was a Saturday, and my father-in-law, he works every other Sunday. And so he had to work the following day. So we go to the Tallgrass How to Brew Day, and I want to say it was pretty confident that was 2011.
Okay, 2008 and, first batch, 2011.
Yeah, we go to this How to Brew Day thing. So we go through the deal, and we had very specific instructions. We were to go to this. We were supposed to behave ourselves because on the way back we were going to go to church because Joe had to work the next day. Okay. So we were just going to catch church there in Junction City on the way home. So long story short, we ended up getting face drunk, drinking beers with their brewmaster at the time, Andrew Hood, who was from California. And so he's like, you guys are awesome. He was pulling out stuff like his parents from California would send him, like Lost Abbey and, we drank some Russian River. So like stuff that people used to kill for around here, we were drinking, and he was telling me about all these other things. I was like, oh, that's awesome. And so at one point, Joe's like, I don't think I'm going to make it to church. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I'm like, you know what? I don't think I can drive home either. And so I ended up having to call Misty, and her and my sister-in-law came to pick us up, and we were still drinking. Misty basically had to drag us out of there, and she was pissed off so bad. But the whole ride home, so Joe rode with my sister-in-law, and then I rode with Misty. And the whole way home, I guess both of us were like, we're doing this. This is so great. You know, I was like, we want this. And we basically made it back. We kind of sobered up a little bit. We had dinner. So we missed church. And then Joe actually had to call in sick to work because he was so hungover. But we basically, that whole time, once we got home, like around 8 o'clock or something like that, until like 11, we kind of hatched this plan. So fast forward, like my brother-in-law, he wasn't able to do it. They were a young family. Misty's sister and her brother-in-law, her husband, he ended up joining the Army. And so he got deployed, twice. And so we were.
So your numbers are dwindling here.
Yeah. And so after he got back from his last deployment, we were pushing, and this was the end of like 2013. We started pushing pretty hard to find a space. We talked about doing it in Chapman, and that just wasn't going to work. So we decided to move it up here. We were going to do a production brewery because the rules in Kansas are a little bit wonky. Looked into some stuff and then started running the numbers, and the numbers weren't there. And so we decided that maybe what we could do is look in Kansas City, Missouri, because on the Missouri side, the rules for breweries are a lot more, I wouldn't say lax, but the requirements as far as what you had, the hoops you had to jump through, as far as numbers were a little bit easier.
And I can imagine, based on the fact that Kansas now has full beer as of last couple of years. Yeah, so I can imagine just brewing the beer would be a little more difficult on Kansas side.
Well, see, that's where the kind of the crux of it is. The brewing the part is easy. It's the selling it and how you sell it is where kind of the hang up comes.
Okay.
So at one point, we couldn't find anything on the Missouri side or anything that really kind of fit us, like Misty and I and Joe and I. Because at that point, Misty's brother-in-law, our brother-in-law, decided that he was going to make the Army his full-time career, and they just weren't going to have the ability to participate as much as they anticipated. So they decided to no longer be part of the business. So it's just at this point now, and this is about January, I'd say at 2014 or so.
Okay.
Maybe 2013. I like the timeline. It's been so long. And so we, at that point, just kind of hammered down and started trying to figure things out. We looked all over KCMO and could not find anything that fit us or fit within our price range that met all the things we needed. And so we decided that we wanted to open it up in Olathe. And so that's where kind of the monkey wrench kind of got thrown into things, because the way Kansas law is set up, after Prohibition was repealed, when they made it legal to have alcoholic liquor in the state, you could have it, but you had to belong to a social club type thing.
Okay.
So Eagles Club or, whatever. So you had to pay a fee, you had to wait 10 days, and then you could go in and drink beer. But you couldn't have it at like a bar. You couldn't go, there weren't actual quote unquote bars, or like you couldn't go to a restaurant and a hamburger and get a Bud Light with it until I think it's 1989 or 1991, where what they did was they attached it to the state constitution and allow each individual county to decide how they want it. So you could either be completely dry, which you can't sell any alcohol, but you can have it if you go outside and bring it in. You can even manufacture it in a dry county. You just can't sell it.
Wow, that's just so unique. Like that's and it's I even think now like $1 drink at Applebee's, like that's just so common, just the consumption of alcohol like that, but not at the time.
Oh, absolutely. And then so you either were a completely dry county. And this is all on a vote, so you had to do it on a ballot that either had a congressman being elected or congressperson being elected or the president. So every 4 years, essentially, is the only time it could be on. It's got to be on a specific ballot measure. It's my understanding. And so you could be either completely dry, completely wet, or what they call wet with a 30% food rule. Johnson County elected to be wet with a 30% food rule, and now what that means is we're obligated to sell 30% of our on-site sales have to be comprised of food. And the state essentially defines food as anything you put in your mouth that's not alcoholic. So it's nice if you look at it. They're very simple. I mean, I think our license law only has like 4 lines to it or 6 lines.
Really?
Yeah. But then they have all these other kind of requirements. So it's good and it's bad. And so at one point I called and spoke to Ron Shaver, who is the city attorney for the city of Olathe. And I said, hey, I just had a question. This is what we're wanting to do. I'm looking at this licensing, and this is what it says. And I went through and I read it line by line. He pulled it up on his computer and read it line by line. I was like, so now if I sell any food, like this law doesn't dictate that I have to have a kitchen, right? Nowhere in there does it say that I have to have a kitchen staff and a head chef and this and that.
Because it's not, the emphasis isn't on the production like you're saying. It's on the actual selling.
Correct. And so I asked him, I'm like, so the way I read this is if I sold donuts that I bought from Dunkin' Donuts over here, and as long as I sold, $1,000 of, I had $1,000 of sales in a year, but 70% of them came from alcohol and 30% of them came from
whatever
donuts. Yeah, that would mean I would be in line with this law. He goes, yes. I was like, is there anything in the city that says anything different? He's like, no, ours models after the state one. So as long as you have 30%, he said, a couple requirements here, there, and the other, that as long as they won't give us our license until we're certified by the state, but we apply for them at the same time.
Okay.
So we just basically have to send the stuff that we send to the state to the city. And I was like, all right. And so we started looking around Olathe, found a space, and then ended up kind of getting coaxed away to Spring Hill by a gentleman. So we ended up starting the brewery in Spring Hill, and we opened up October 15th or 17th. God, I can't remember which one. Of 2015.
Wow. So that's quite the journey. Just literally not having any skin in the game. Just I kind of didn't really like beer all that much to, okay, this is my profession.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No. And it's a little bit, that's kind of like the 1,000-foot view of it. Yeah. There's a lot. Yeah. There's a lot more that kind of went into it. Like, I mean, it was every waking hour. Like I would go to work, and I worked, like I said, I worked at Cisco at the time. I would work between 50 and 60 hours a week. Then my weekends were making as many beers as I could to kind of come up with the batches that we were going to have. And then just learning as many things as I could. And then figuring out how to apply them to a much larger scale.
So I'm going to go back to something you kind of mentioned earlier. You mentioned the word nano brewery. There's a lot of terms that I've heard, like micro, nano, obviously probably synonymous, but what's the difference between something like that versus like what Bud Light has going, or like Anheuser?
So those are just kind of like nano brew just kind of is like just an industry wide kind of like one of these term catchphrase, but that's just kind of where it started. Like a lot of these guys, without having to basically like get a massive loan, you could go out and either source equipment or find equipment. And basically nanobrewery is something like you're making like 3 barrels or less per batch. And that originally started out with guys were making like in between like 15 gallons and 30 gallons at a time.
So we're talking about the quantity being produced. That's what we're really talking about.
Yeah, and so you had like your macro brews, which would be your Bud Light, your Coors Lights, your Miller Lights, and all those companies like that, the guys you see everywhere. And then you had your micro brews, which would technically at the time, so like mid to late 2000s, would have been like your micro brews would have been your Boulevard, your New Belgiums, your tall grasses, because they were operating on a little bit larger scale. So the nano brew, I'm not really sure where like the threshold is. I think the Brewers Association now has kind of like, it's less the size of your brewery, it's more the production output you have and how you get classified. And nano brewery now is kind of gone by the wayside a little bit. There's still some guys out there, but there's so many companies out there manufacturing equipment that's a lot bigger. And so
changes the classification.
Like, yeah, now the Brewers Association has been smart enough about it and they classify more so based on your production is how much you produce in a year. That dictates the size, quote unquote, the size. They're small. Like, I don't even know. There's like, because it's like stuff that it doesn't really apply to me.
Currently.
But it's just, like back in the day when the craft boom, this cycle of the craft boom started, like nano brew would be someone making between, I'd say 15 gallons to 2 barrels at a time. So between 15 and 60 gallons at a time. And then you got the guys that kind of took the next step up and bought like purpose built equipment, which would be a 5 barrel, which, sometimes you had guys finding stuff in like Canada or Europe and importing it cheap, or they were modifying equipment that was out there to suit their needs. That's kind of where we ended up. Like I kind of circling back to that engineering, there's a gentleman named Tom Hennessy who owns a brewery. I think he owns 2 breweries now in Colorado, but he's owned, I think, like somewhere in the neighborhood of like 7 or 8 that he's built and then sold off.
Okay.
But he made and you can find it on YouTube, he made a video called Frankenbrew. And basically he kind of the same thing as us. He had owned like a pizza joint down in Arizona, I think, and then kind of got the bug to make his own beer and just went out and found equipment wherever he could and just modified it to his means and ended up building this thing. And it's kind of inspired a lot of people. Now he even runs like a small school in Colorado that kind of teaches you. It's like an immersion type course where you go for 2 weeks, teaches you the ropes, like the down and dirty.
Kind of like what you and your father-in-law kind of went into.
But he's it's kind of like life lessons, and so like there's less trial and error because he's like, these are the things you need to do in order to be successful.
Less of a workshop and more informative.
Yeah, like it's really a great setup. Yeah, you don't have like your company's supposed to bring 2 people. And like one person, this is how you brew. This is what we do. This is how you do it. This is the best like way we've learned on like a small scale kind of production type setup for like, it's mostly like pub type setup or tap room mentality. And then one other person does like all the business type stuff. Like, these are the records you're supposed to keep. This is how long you have to keep. Yeah.
That's really in depth. Like, that covers pretty much all facets that you would need to know right there. Yeah.
And it's like a 2-week little deal. And now he's got to the point where he's had so many people gone through the class. Like a friend of mine is actually taking the class. So the gentleman that owns Smoke Brewing, he's gone through it. And he told me that he didn't even go to the Colorado Boy. That's the name of Tom's breweries now. He went to like one of his students, actually. They offer like kind of like satellite programs.
Wow. There's all these offshoots.
Yeah. And so he's got all these people, and so that have gone through his course that have been successful, and then they basically bring him in and kind of teach them. It's like old school karate or something. Like the student becomes a master kind of a thing, and then they pass it on to somebody else. But yeah, we use a lot. He wrote a book a couple years ago, and I have that book, and we do a lot of the things that he speaks about. Like our mash tun is actually an old dairy tank, and so that we end up having I think $1,000 invested in it, where if we were to purchase it brand new, it'd be somewhere in the neighborhood. Like the least expensive one would be like around $12,000. So right there, right out of the gate, we've already sold ourselves, saved ourselves like $1,100 or $11,000. And so just little stuff like that. I think kind of like I said, that's like old school, like American ingenuity kind of a thing. It's like you have a problem, you figure out what that problem is, and like how you move those obstacles that are keeping you from your destiny.
Yeah. Let's kind of go root back into the actual brewing itself, because obviously that's your forte. We've talked a little bit, it was mentioned a little bit earlier about how you made your first batch, but what are kind of like the general steps to making beer?
So like I said, it's pretty simple. So basically all we do is we add, and we have most of the stuff we have calculators and formulas to figure it out. But for us, we have I have such a tight control or such a working knowledge of our system. So we traditionally will use X amount of grain, and I know with X amount of grain I need X amount of water, and X amount of water at X amount of temperature. And so we have a lot of standardization we use. It just makes life easy for me. We have a starting gravity for some of our beers that we try to hit, and we may vary certain things on that. So what we'll do is we'll mill the grain, and so we'll send it through, and it's not even really milling like in the traditional sense, it's just cracking it. So we take the grain, it's whole seed grain, we put it through a mill. It basically goes through some rollers, and it cracks it open, and it exposes the inside of the grain. So we take that grain, we put it into what's called a mash tun. Mash tun is just basically a big vessel with a grate in the bottom with small holes in it. And what that does is we steep those grains in the mash tun at a specific pH, a specific temperature for a specific amount of time, depending on what beer we want out of that. And so depending on what beer style we're making, it'll sit in there between 60 minutes, either 60, 90, or 120 minutes.
And that's not much variety right there. I mean, that's the timing.
Well, actually, that you get to a point where, as far as like the timing goes, like it's kind of starts dropping off exponentially. We have this sweet spot that we're trying to hit as far as time, and anything after that, like the returns,
diminishing returns.
Essentially, the diminishing returns. Yes, that's what I was trying to. So after a while, it starts dropping off. There's other things that we can do to boost those efficiencies, as far as just letting it sit in there longer. So we could actually add, amylase enzymes to it just to get more extract out.
So once you hit that sweet spot, whatever that is, 60 minutes, whatever, then what?
So what happens is when it goes through the mill, so it's funny, it's called a mill. Anyway, what it does is it basically smashes the grain, and the husks on the grain kind of stay pretty much intact, but the inside is crumbled up and crushed. And so the funny thing is the husks of the grain are actually, once they become waterlogged, become heavier than the inside, and they fall to the bottom. And so they actually develop this natural filter bed. So after 90 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes is what we typically do. We go through a process called Vorlauf. And basically it's a big fancy German word for take the crap off the bottom and put it on top.
Okay.
I don't know if that's the actual definition, but that's what we do. So we open the valve at the bottom. We have a pump attached to it. And what we'll do is we'll recirculate it, because when you do crush the grain, a little bit of like flour essentially is made. And that's to make its way to the bottom. And what we want to do is suck all the flour out and redeposit it on the top. And so what that's doing is those holes are making their way to the bottom where the grate is. And so it's acting as a filter bed. So it's like a natural process where the endosperm and whatnot are inside, and they're floating kind of towards the top, and all the holes are down at the bottom, and they act like a natural filter. And so you Vorlauf just to keep some of that grain out of the kettle. And so we'll do that for a little bit, and we'll check our temperature, we'll check our mash pH, make sure it's all in spec. Then we'll stop it, let it sit for a minute, and then we'll at that point we'll take it, instead of pumping it on top, we'll transfer it over into the kettle. So once we hook it to the kettle, we'll open the valves up, let it start flowing in naturally at first. At that point, what we're going to do is we're going to start sprinkling water over the top of the mash in the mash tun, and that's called sparging. And so it's kind of weird. It's all these words. So it's let me back up. When we hook the mash tun to the kettle, that's called launching. So we're launching at this point, which is basically just draining from one kettle or one vessel to another.
Simple enough.
Yeah, and so that's launching. So then we'll start what's called sparging. And sparging is basically just sprinkling hot water on top of the mash. That works kind of like, remember when you were a kid and you had those little things that were like oil and water mixed together?
Yeah.
You know, because the oil is lighter than the water. So essentially the same process. You know, after the saccharification is what it's called, where those starches, the enzymes in the grain the enzymes that live on the grain naturally are activated by the hot water. They go to work on the starch in the grain, and they convert it from starch into sugar. And so the sugar is just like anything. It's just maltose, basically. It's heavier than the water. So as you sprinkle water on top of it, the water is lighter. It kind of resides on top, and it kind of acts like a plunger and helps to push
to
down
get that into the other tank.
Yeah. Yeah, it works just like almost essentially like a plunger is the best kind of analogy.
Just pushing it down to get into the other tank.
Yep. And so also what it's doing is, because of osmosis, you still have some sugar that's trapped in those grains. And so it's, once you get to kind of homeostasis within the mash, you can't extract any more sugar out of the grain. Now with this fresh water coming and being sprinkled on top, that sugar can move from the grain into that sparge water, and then you get a little bit more extraction out of it. So you can kind of get as much without grabbing, basically wringing out all the water, all the sugar, excuse me. It's just using osmosis
in your favor
to migrate from. Yes. And so we do that until the kettle is essentially full to where we need it to be. And then we shut everything off and drain it. The rest of it kind of goes down the drain. Turn on the kettle. Once we hit a certain level, turn it on. Boiling starts. Once the boiling starts, we add in, depending on what beer we're making, depends on how long we boil it, and then when we add hops. So for us, with our water profile, we typically like a beer that isn't really hoppy. So like Isabel is a beer I'm sure you've served
the Belgian blonde.
Yes. So it basically just gets what's called a bittering charge. So once it starts boiling, now there's little things in there. Once the boil starts on it, it goes for a little bit. We give it a bittering charge. That's just to balance out how much sugar is left in it after attenuation. So the beer doesn't taste like sugar water and beer. And then, so like our hoppy beers, we typically hit those in the whirlpool at the end. And so that we get extraction. We put a lot more. So for example,
that bittering charge, that's the hops, right?
Yes. Okay. Yes. So we put, like I said, depending on what type of beer we're making, depends on when we put the hops in and how much hops we put in. So like Isabel, for example, is 30 IBUs, and that's international bittering unit. So that's just a kind of a measurement of how bitter the beer is and how. And so it's 30 IBUs. We do, I think it's actually 30 ounces of our bittering hop at 60 minutes. So that will go into the beer. It'll be boiled for at least 60 minutes until we shut off the fire of the kettle and then let it steep for a minute. So like Francis, which is our pale ale, it's also 30 IBUs, but instead of getting just 30 ounces at the beginning, it all goes in at the very end at the whirlpool stage, and it gets, I have to look at my notes, it's between 4 and 5 pounds at the end. So you have to use almost twice as much to get the same amount of bitterness at the end versus the beginning, because it's called efficiencies, because it basically is extracting out more of that bitterness as it boils.
Once again, that timing is going to be important when you put that in. And you've mentioned whirlpool, so I'm assuming that's happening after you've boiled it. What's that kind of?
So whirlpool it's just a manner of separation. So we're throwing all these hops into the boil. So what happens is at the end of the boil, we shut off the fire. We let it kind of settle for a minute, because it's been at 212 degrees for at least an hour. At whirlpool, what we do is there's a port on there that will pull the wort out of the bottom of the kettle, and then it'll pump it right back into it, but it goes in at an angle. And what that does is it causes the entire mass in the kettle to spin in a circle. And as it's spinning in a circle, it's also kind of forming like an upside down tornado is the best way to explain it. And so we have all these processes that happen in the boil. So we have what's called the hot break, where all the proteins from the grain that are kind of viscous, when they boil, they basically come out of suspension essentially, and then they coagulate together. And so it kind of looks like egg drop soup.
Okay.
In the kettle. like before the boil starts, you'll get all this foam at the top, kind of like on a regular beer, but it's kind of almost like a meringue.
Okay.
Because it's all protein and it's all this stuff that kind of floats to the top. And then once the boil starts, all of that kind of coagulates together and firms up. And then you can see it kind of just, it's like these big flocks of protein just floating around in the boil the whole time. So we obviously don't want that into the fermenter.
Yeah.
After the boil's over, like I said, we start this whirlpooling process and we let it go for about 20 minutes. And then it spins, around in circles and then like an upside down tornado. And what happens is everything kind of bunches up and drops to the bottom and middle of the boil kettle. And so at the end, once it rests for a while, what that allows us to do is siphon off as clean a wort as we can and get it through the heat exchanger, which is what cools the beer down to like pitching temperature. Because we start at 212 degrees. We put it through the heat exchanger. We don't want the hops going through it, and we don't want the hot break and the proteins going through it. It just gums it up. And so by spinning it in the whirlpool, it allows it to clump together in the middle, and then it all will form up. We use a couple processes, a couple ingredients that we throw in there that actually kind of act as almost like a magnet, essentially, and group everything together and fall down.
And you use the word wort, was it?
It's wort, W-O-R-T.
So that's the final product you're going to get from after the whirlpool stage and boiling and all that.
Yes. So wort is any sugar, water. It's anything that we create, minus the grain, before we add yeast to it. So legally, quote unquote, once we add yeast to it, it's beer at that point. Wort is the unspoiled sugar water that we're creating.
Okay. And so you've cooled this wort, and then I'm guessing you're going to have to ferment it, right? So
it goes into the fermenter, and then at that point we inoculate it with a yeast strain, depending on what type of beer it is. We have several that we use. We have a couple house yeasts, and then we have a couple like specialty yeasts that we pull in every now and then. So once you inoculate it with with your yeast, it's technically beer at that point, even if no fermentation has gone on. It's just weird U.S. government regulations. So depending on what yeast we use, we have a fermentation profile. Depending on X, we'll do Y. So like our IPA, for example, we started out at 65 degrees and then let it go there for about 2 days, and then we let it free rise up to about 71 degrees. At the point where it hits its terminal gravity, which we know just from experience will pull the yeast off the bottom of the cone, because our tanks are coned at the bottom. So we'll chill it down just a little bit, and that yeast will actually group together the same way, kind of similar way that it does in the boil kettle, and fall to the bottom. And we'll pull that off and we'll reuse it. And at this point, we'll actually add for our IPA, we'll add dry hops to the top of it, and then allow those to sit in there for, typically we do 3 to 4 days. Then with same thing, we'll let them fall to the bottom. We'll pull those off, chill the beer down to get any residual either hops or yeast to flocculate to the bottom of the cone. And then we'll pull that out, move it into what we call a bright tank. And in the bright tank is basically the same as the fermenter, except for their round bottom. And we have a stone in those that we inject CO2 into, and that's how we carbonate the beer. So it'll go into the cold room, or sometimes we can actually use our other fermenters if we're short on space. But then we'll inject CO2 into them, we'll carbonate them in the tank, and then once they hit a certain volume, typically it's like 2.3. So for every gallon of beer, I have 2.3 gallons of compressed CO2 dissolved into those.
Wow.
Put a special adapter onto the tank, and we'll put it into kegs, and then we'll put them online and sell them, or we'll give them to our distributor and they'll sell them to the market.
That's pretty complex through a lot of different variables.
Yeah, well, I mean, and the part of it is it sounds complex. It's just one of those things. It's just like anything. It's like driving a car.
Yeah.
It's like, when you start out driving a car, you're scared shitless. But then after you've done it for 5 or 10 years, it's like, you get to that point where crap, I don't remember the last 10.
Now I'm going 85 like it's nothing.
Yeah, and realize that it's like, well, normally, like, where the hell am I? You have that that autopilot, and it kind of becomes that. It's like once, and that's one of the things I think that's kind of like bit of my science background. It's like try to do not change things, like do things the same each time. Or if you change things, only change one thing. Don't change like 5 things, then you don't know
you don't know where you're at or why the end result is the way it is.
Yeah, and so we rarely change anything, and if we do, it's only 1 or 2 things, and those 1 or 2 things may only be like one thing may be in like a hot side, like on the brew side, and the other thing may be on the other side. And then if it doesn't quite come out the way we anticipated, just give the beer a different name.
So I'm gonna cut back before the brewing process real quick. So what are our core ingredients in making a beer?
So the 4 ingredients in beer: there's water, malt, yeast, and hops. And so technically it's not, you can have water, malt, and hops, but they're not beer until you put in the yeast.
Yeah. That's the legally speaking.
Yeah. And then there's some weird little rules on that too, like the percentages, like certain things are like it has to be like a cereal malt grain. And so it's just not malt. You can use rye, wheat, shit. You can use quinoa. You can use
couscous.
Rice. Yeah. Actually, I think isn't couscous technically a pasta?
Yes, something.
I think it is. So I think you could actually use it, but you'd have to use it like an ancillary ingredient. Couscous is a dish.
Yeah.
Steam balls, crushed durum wheat, and semolina. So yeah, you can actually technically make beer out of couscous. Yes,
you may have to experiment with that.
You might have to get what we call formulary approval by the government
to be making some couscous liqueur. We've talked about the process and all this stuff, and it obviously, as we've mentioned, it varies based upon what style of beer you're going for. I know that there are 2 different types or categories of beer. You have the ale and a lager, and so what kind is the obviously, there are different things that fall into each one of them, but what are kind of the main distinctions between the 2?
So technically the only real main distinction because is the type of yeast. And I'm going to butcher these. So all yeast comes from, I think it's a family or genus. I don't know. Like I failed biology miserably. But they're Saccharomyces is what the yeasts are called. And so Saccharomyces basically translates into sugar fungus. And so Saccharomyces are a non-spore producing yeast.
Okay.
And so you have 2 types of Saccharomyces that are acceptable for use in the brewing applications. You have Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Like I said, I'm gonna butcher these.
Okay.
And then it's like Saccharomyces like alpastorius.
So you have these 2 different types of yeast.
Yeah, and essentially they're just kissing cousins. And so one is been essentially genetically groomed through evolution to work at a higher temperature. And then so you have like Saccharomyces pastoris, basically lager yeast. And so way back in the day, they didn't have the automatic control of temperatures like we do now. And so they would traditionally, it's like say in Germany or the Czech Republic, there was only a slim window in which they can make beer because if it got too hot, typically it became, they didn't have the pasteurization techniques that we have today. Obviously, they didn't have the aseptic techniques. And so essentially they got dudes with buckets dumping wort into vessels and they rolled them into caves. But the lager yeast, they would throw a buttload in there and it would it's like the idea of like the big fish in a small pond. And so the more yeast they had in there, the greater chance of success they had that the other like beer spoiling organisms. So the anaerobic or aerobic bacteria that are going to be fighting for to live in the wort, they have certain temperature ranges that they are more active at, typically higher, like in the 90, like bacteria typically like the same temperature like we're at. So like the 95, 96 degree range.
Okay.
So if you take a huge pitch of yeast and then, like, so they're keeping it in wooden buckets and stuff back in the day.
So it's really
super clean. Yeah, super clean. Yeah. But then you throw a bunch of it in there, and then if they're keeping it cold because they're storing it down in caves, you throw it in there, and then you start. It does take a little bit of time to get going, but because now it's in the conditions are more beneficial towards the brewer's yeast than they are towards the bacteria that would spoil that beer. They outperform, and then you end up getting a beer. It may not be as good as like a beer that Polliner is producing today. I mean, but back in the 1500s, you get what you get, and you don't throw a fit.
Yeah. You're not going to have as good quality control back then.
I'm pretty sure that these cats are just wanting to live to be 25. So, and the same thing, like we get yeast strains that actually have genetic markers, and like we use a yeast on occasion. It's called American ale yeast. And so it's like a kissing cousin to the same yeast that they use at Sierra Nevada. And no, I don't know where they source this yeast, but it has a certain range, a temperature range that it works best at. And just from like knowledge or just experience and having stuff go sideways for us, I know that it says between this number and this number, but if it goes a little bit above that or a little bit below that, I kind of know where it's going to land. Same thing, we use a yeast that's sourced from England that because of experience, if it gets above or below that, if it gets below it, it's going to go dormant and not finish fermenting. And if it goes above that temperature, the beer is going to taste like ale. Okay. And a lot of that is just, it's like pure Darwinism. It's a result of the environment. So, the environment, when they only brewed in Germany during certain times of the year, because basically when summer hits, it's too hot. And then you're going to spoil those beers. In England, they have a more temperate climate because of where they're at with the North Sea and stuff like that, where it's a little bit cooler. And so their yeast, they basically ferment in gigantic oak barrels at certain temperatures, same thing at certain times of the year. But they would get different. They were able to use these ale yeasts and ferment them out because the day-to-day temperatures were a little bit lower,
Okay, so the main distinction is what heat the yeast requires, right?
Yeah, I mean, and that's the biggest thing. Yeah, and actually, what they're finding out now too is that done in the right manner, lager yeast, like certain lager yeast, you can use at a much higher temperature. And so we've been experimenting with that. And some of the lagers that we produce, actually, we ferment at a much higher, more of like an ale temperature than the traditional lager yeast that we use is different than KC Beer uses. And KC Beer uses traditional methods. And so they're fermenting at like 55 degrees for like 6 weeks. We're using a different yeast that has a wider range, and we're fermenting at like 62 degrees. We started a little bit lower or higher. We have a kind of specialized schedule. It takes a lot more attention, but we're able to start at a certain temperature, drop, and then raise it back up. And then we get a similar beer. Granted, it's different flavor because the yeast will produce different esters and phenols. But we're able to produce, quality lager beers in much less time than they do over KC Beer.
Lagers typically the lower heat, whereas the ale's typically higher. But you're finding now that lager, you can add a little more heat to it than previously thought.
Yeah, and there's a lot, and that's the nice thing about kind of the boom in craft beer right now is there's so many companies out there vying for market share, not just at the brewery level, but all the ancillary suppliers like the yeast guys, the hop guys, all that stuff. The more research they do that we get access to, the better things kind of become.
Yeah, that competition, you're going to benefit from that.
Yeah, the market's always going to adjust itself. And it's kind of one of those things that's like, it's a great time to be alive kind of a mentality, because like we're learning all these new things. Like now, like just like you say like ale yeast and lager yeast, but now they're actually coming out with there's all these different kind of like groupings. Like now, like it's so funny. Like every time it's Kvik strains are from Norway. And every time I say it, it's like Kvik is so hot, but like from Zoolander. But like we have a beer going right now. We're using this yeast strain called Salmonitis, which is actually from Lithuania. But traditionally, like ales are fermented in the neighborhood of say 62 degrees to 72 degrees. So they kind of a narrow band. And so with the Kvik strains are traditional Norwegian farmhouse strains that were used and then only used like once or twice a year for like, say, like Christmas or like weddings or like funerals. And so you had these house strains that were like family, like they have these names and they're typically named after the farmer. And they have like their traditional way of doing it. Like their filter bed was made out of like spruce leaf, like spruce branches and stuff.
So
And then,
it's like grandma's recipe, like what we had, our family had
yeah,
around.
it's, and I'd even go so far as saying like the idea, like the advent of like San Francisco sourdough bread, you know, like you would put it out on the windowsill and or like let the dough proof and then just the flora fauna kind of a thing with it blowing into the window. There's some bacteria that lands on that bread and sours it just a little bit while you're waiting for it to proof, and then you bake it. It has like this nice like flavor to it. It's kind of that. It just happens to be what's there at the time, you know. And I'm sure probably some of it comes from like me making. I don't know how they ended up like this. My only thought is, you know, what you would do is you'd make this beer in the morning and then you would throw like 20 logs on the fire and then you go out and do your chores in the middle of, you know, minus 20 because you want your house to figure it would ramp up and then cool off a little bit by the time you got home. Anyway, these beers would ferment at like 90 degrees, which for traditional brewer yeast, like if you fermented something at 90 degrees, it would taste like fingernail polish.
Really?
Yeah, because that's just one of the off products. Like if you get yeast too hot, it'll start leaking out these off flavors, and that's one.
Really?
But with these yeast, because they were forced to work at such high temperatures, then they, in essence, get like kind of like through Darwinism, like accustomed to that climate.
And then you can use that to your advantage.
Absolutely. So we have two beers right now that we make. One uses Simoneus, one uses Tormagarden. Simoneus we ferment at like 90 degrees, and the Tormagarden we actually ferment at like 103 degrees. And then they're just like beasts. Like the Tormagarden beer ferments out in I think 4 days, and then the Simoneus just depends on how big of a beer.
So we have these two different distinctions, right? We have the lagers and we have the ales. What are going to be some common styles that fit within each of those categories?
So like with lagers, you know, you have your like if you want to go like macro, then like American light lager, which essentially what those guys have done is figured out ways to cut their cost of goods by they use grain because you legally have to, but then they add some type of other simple sugars into them, whether it be corn syrup or rice solid syrups. Or not even syrups. They may take them and actually use corn, and then you can use an amylase enzyme, and you can go through you can mash it separately and then combine those. It does change the flavor. And then ale yeast is essentially 90% of the market. So, well, I'd say 90% of the craft beer market, because obviously the big guys make. I mean, Anheuser-Busch probably spills more water out of their water fountains than craft beer produces in a year.
Wow.
But when you're looking at everything else, I mean, you have, I guess technically like Sierra Nevada, or not Sierra, Sam Adams is no longer technically craft beer. And the majority of their stuff is lager based. But like Sierra Nevada is the largest brewery in America, craft brewer in America. And I'd say 90% of their stuff is ale based. And so I'd probably say some of ours is, and we do some faux lagers. The grist that make up the recipe, and then just how we use the yeast. And so it just produces a beer that's really bright, really crisp, like a lager, without the esters. So like we have American light lager that we actually use an ale yeast in it, but we lager it, which that then makes it a lager. Because lagering also means to store cold. And so that's just, so we lager that beer. We let it sit cold for an extended period of time, and then all the yeast drops out of it. It's super bright, and because it's super bright and really lower in body, that makes it really crisp and drinkable. So essentially the same way that like some craft beers.
We talked a lot about like personal preference playing a big role in brewing. What is the process of say I'm going to make a pale ale or whatever? What is the decision making process to say I'm going to make this type of beer?
Well, some of it for us, because we kind of operate like in a pub type model. some of it's just like what we have on tap. And so we typically don't kind of get caught up of having like a bajillion things on tap. We try to have like 9 or so. But there's like kind of for like our customers, like I want to make stuff to help bring customers.
Okay.
In. And so I have, you'll have breweries out there that all they have on tap are IPAs. Well, or all they do is sour beers, and for us being a tap room model, that's where 99% of our revenue comes from. I don't want to just make IPAs. I'd love to just make IPAs, but I also need to bring in other customers. I can't just bring in the guys that drink 20% of the beer. Then I'm losing 80% of the potential customers. In the same sense, I have to have something that, like, I've got a couple beers that I personally that we make that I like, but I don't go and get a pull of them every day.
Yeah.
But then I have customers that if they're not up, they're pissed. So, we try to hit, you have your customer base is so wide. We want to make sure that everybody from the left side of that customer base to the right side of the customer base, there's something in there that they can drink, to the point that we actually now we sell wine and cider as well. And then we do a margarita now.
I could see where that would be advantageous to kind of have a little bit of everything.
And then, we're even looking at adding some other stuff. Especially with the COVID thing right now, you have to be dynamic. And then you have to try to have something that I don't want to call it a gimmick or being kitschy, but I have to, I have X amount of seats, and we've had to pull out a lot of seats because of COVID. And so I need to make sure that before, the whole idea, like with a quote unquote restaurant, was 75% of seats being full every night or you're going to be losing money.
Uh-huh.
So now for me, it's not so much 75% seats every night. I got to hit a certain percentage throughout the week. And I know this day is going to be low. This day is going to be low. Okay, how do I profit more on these days? And so what things do we focus on these days when people more have to come out?
Uh-huh.
Like right now, we're filming this, and I'd rather be outside because it's freaking beautiful. But we've been really busy, and yesterday we were really busy. And so those are the things that we gear up towards now. And then with Corey out in the food truck, that's been another kind of blessing, like moving from just the straight food truck model where we have rotations or have a rotation to having a consistent menu all the time has been actually fantastic.
And you kind of briefly brought it up. You say, oh, it's so nice outside. That kind of lends its hand to those seasonal beers, that you want to have on tap. It's summer. We might have the tropical pale ale, things like that.
Yeah, and so and actually that tropical pale ale, I actually brewed that the other day. So because we get such a good return. But we released our fall beer, which is an alt beer, so it's kind of similar to like an Oktoberfest. It's just an ale.
Okay.
And so we released it yesterday to a pretty good response. I was here yesterday kegging another batch of beer, and they literally blew through the first keg in I think a good 3 hours. So
really,
it ended up having a really good response.
So, in your opinion, what makes a good beer?
And see, I like how you preface it with my opinion, because that's like the craziest thing, because I honestly think, like, I have an opinion about what makes a good beer, but my opinion only matters for my beers.
Okay.
Yeah. We drive to do the very best we possibly can. And like I said before, like, we don't change things unless something's not working or something's not right.
Uh-huh.
And so we're always kind of like striving for the idea, and I had this idea once for like a mission statement for the brew house, and it was like everything for a reason. And then I Googled it and found out that was another brewery's a much bigger brewery than we are. Their motto, I think it's for Elma Gang. But we try to do everything the best we can with what we have. I remember it's like someone told me it's like racing a car. Like you can take some schmuck who can drive a car and put him in a race car, and he can't do shit in it.
Yeah.
But you can take a race car driver and put him in a Honda Civic, and then they can make it that no one else can.
Yeah.
It's kind of like thing. Like I always strive to be the race car driver in the Honda, knowing that we're not a massive company with investors and millions of dollars of, backing and stuff like that, and but still try to take what we have and make the absolute best product with it. And these are kind of some of my things, like generalized, like clean beer, where it doesn't matter what it is. When you drink it, there's a flavor where the flavor in my description kind of bounces to the back of your palate and then back forward again.
Okay.
Lingers for a bit and it's gone, and so there's no residual flavor left in it. And I think that's really it. It's like a weird little thing. Like I love all beer, like as an art form. But then there's all that technical part about it where, it's like I've had good beers that are sounding like theory, but in execution, they've not been so great. Like, and I'm not a huge sour beer, but I literally yesterday drank probably one of the greatest beers I've ever had in my life. And that was from, my friends at Sandhill. And it was just like the perfect amount of tartness. It was like the perfect amount of back sweetness from the fruit they put in it. It wasn't overly carbonated. It was just so good.
So that tasting experience, is it mutually exclusive to it's applicable to any style of beer, what you're saying?
I absolutely think so. Like I typically lean towards IPAs just because I love the flavor of hops. I love that bitterness. And it's one of those things, it's like the more you get, and I think you get it with sour beers too. Like the more you drink a bitter beer, the more you kind of want it. It's kind of weird. But like I love a good hoppy beer that's not like overly bitter, where I can taste like all the nuance in it, like a little bit of the malt, but mostly I want the hops and the hop flavor. And then it's dry hop properly, where the dry hop aroma is always there. And that's one of the things, like we change our process to see how we can keep as much of the hop aroma in a beer as possible without having to go and shoehorn, but you can put a ton of dry hop in it, but you don't necessarily come out with a better beer, in my opinion. Like there's a lot of things that can go sideways when you put too many hops in a beer. And it's kind of like a balance between too much and less is more kind of a thing.
I did think it was interesting when I was just kind of looking in the, beer in general, and I found out that, hops are like a relative of like marijuana. And I kind of, it makes sense, like that aromatic, like strong kind of flowery quality in both things. It's like, oh, but it's blatantly obvious. I can see the connection made there.
Yeah. And then you can even find some hops that literally like old school, like Columbus hops smell like they use a descriptor. It's kind of, I think, dank is the best way. Like I've been in places where they've been chopping up or like parsing out Columbus, and it smells like straight weed.
Really?
And you get a couple of, yeah, there's a new kind of like offshoot. They're called Neo Mexicanos. And these are actually wild hops they found growing in like the Four Corners region, like down around New Mexico, Arizona. And they've started crossbreeding these with American hops, and they're like really earthy and dank, and like there's a new one, like Frank Zappa kind of helped push it. And so it's called Zappa, and it's like sweet weed. It's like modern day weed, like Pineapple Express kind of a
really
thing.
You're like,
Yeah.
officer, I'm just a local brewer with some hops in my trunk.
Yes. Nope, I don't drive around with any of that stuff because anymore. But ours is, it's not, I mean, you look at it, it's obviously not the same. Like it's the way you package it, the way you dry it up and stuff, especially in the pellets. It's like no one's like, that is not hash, chief.
Yeah.
That is
I got you. Let's see what else I can conjure up for you here. So obviously, like, the brewing process in its entirety is important, but, and you mentioned like you have certain types of styles of beers that you like. What do you think is like one of the more important ingredients to you?
To me, I'm kind of like twofold. Like I like the expressiveness of some yeasts. Like the house yeast we have now for all our ales or for our American style ales, produces a lot of like citrus notes, like a lot of grapefruit and like orange pith. And then I also like the new type of hops that are coming out. Like, so like probably one of my favorite right now is this one called Grüngeist, which it's like German for like green ghost. And it's a proprietary hop that's grown for our main hop supplier. And it's one of the main things we look at is called alpha acids, and that kind of helps calculate our bitterness. Traditionally, like American hops, especially like American aroma hops, have been like in a mid range, so like between like 10 and like 17 alpha, and this one is like 2.5 to like 3.5 alpha, but it's beautiful. It's like super like. Normally, that oil content is what we look for as far as the alpha content is what we look at to kind of gauge like how expressive it's going to be. But this one's super low, almost like a German noble hop, like old school hops. But then has this fantastic, like it blends. It's does well on its own, but I think it's better blended with other stuff. Like we do a beer with it and Huel Melon, and it has like lemon lime and green like cantaloupe notes to it, and I freaking love it. But yeah, like I'm always looking for like new cool hops to use, especially like in the dry hop. Like we use one called Styrian Wolf that has like strawberry and rhubarb and like a little bit like earthy undertones and like some herbal characters, but it blends well with some of our American stuff. And I have this one right now that I'm getting ready to use in a beer called Lotus. And just off the top of my head, give me 2 seconds. I can kind of pull it up and tell you.
I have to say briefly that the Green Ghost or whatever Green Ghost strain of hop sounds like marijuana. There's no way.
I don't know if that's, but hold on, let me find the Lotus one is supposed to be really freaking nice, and I just kind of scored some like the last minute, and the guy's like, hey, I got some of this, you want it? I'm like, yeah. So it's got aroma specific is orange, vanilla, berry, tropical fruits. And then it's funny, it's like when they have like genetic origin, and it's 50% Eastern Gold, like 25% Apollo, Cascade, and USDA like 90. So basically it's basically made up of all these other hops that are like $3 a pound if I were to buy them.
Really?
Yeah, and then they kind of blend them together and they make this fantastic, like beautifully smelling hop, and this like nice. I mean, it's like the alpha, it's like 13 to 17, and then like they give us like all the other like little percentage of total and stuff like that, the beta chlorophenol and humulene, and from that you can kind of figure out like generally where it stands when it compares to like other hops. But then it has like a sugar like, so there's a couple hops out there that like when you add them, they kind of add like a sweetness.
Mm-hmm.
And so they've added this sugar like on the aroma. It just kind of adds this something that it just wasn't there with it before you dry hop, and then after you dry hop, it's like, oh, that's new. That's new.
It's pretty neat.
Yeah. So yeah, like one of the new things too is kind of getting like blends, and like for us, we try to hit like dry hop with like 2 or more hops, because then it kind of builds like a layer of complexity. So there's a couple other ones like we're looking at. Like there's this one called Satana, which is like pineapple and citrus, and it literally is frickin'. It's like a pineapple bomb
in your mouth.
Yeah, mostly in your nose. Because I mean, I'm like that one. It's like we always see these people that are like, oh, this is the best beer I've ever had, and like I'll get it, and I'm like, well, there's no hop aroma,
and that plays a part.
I think that's the biggest part. Like flavor obviously is a huge factor, because you it doesn't matter what it smells like. If it tastes like shit, you don't want to drink it.
Yeah.
But
soap.
Like, yeah, like soap. I don't want. What did you just say? Soap.
Yeah.
Yeah. I actually hate that. Like, and then the new thing, like with some of these New England IPAs, you get guys that are making like, well, what are we gonna do? Like, I'm just gonna dump as much hops in this thing as I can, and the next thing you know, it literally tastes like soap or aspirin, and I'm like, good.
It smells so good, I could use it as a Yankee candle or something.
Yeah. Dehydrate this thing down, throw some whatever glycerol and glycerin in there, and next thing you know, you got a nice bar of soap.
So, do you have any advice out there for home brewers that are kind of wanting to own their own place in the future, or just getting into the nitty gritty of brewing beer?
Some people think that you're just going to start brewing beer, and then it's, it does essentially sell itself, as long as you're making sure you're using quality ingredients, using quality equipment, and doing things right. Like you can't cut corners, but then you're going to have some type of a partnership with somebody, as far as whether it's like for us, it's someone else to kind of help carry the water.
Uh-huh.
I don't know. It's like such a weird thing. Like we had anticipated that it would just be me doing almost everything, and then Misty helping out. And then once we got going, and we ended up doing way more than we ever anticipated. Basically, Misty had to come on and is essentially a full-time plus employee. I mean, she works just as many, if not more hours than I do. And honestly, if it wasn't for her, I mean, we would have probably had gone up belly up years ago.
Like it is quite the investment.
Yeah, and it's not just like a money thing. Like if you're smart about it, you can do it on a tight budget. We've gotten really lucky, and like we're not stretched too far. But like some of that's just being smart and knowing where to look and knowing how to like I said, for me, like if I can't make it, at the very least I can fix it.
Yeah, that's where the experience comes in. I mean, you're talking about the equipment, you're altering that, saving some money there. I mean, you're looking at the ingredients. You kind of know, hey, this one has qualities of this more expensive, ingredient, but we can make that work in our favor,
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things like we talked about, with ingredients, like I like yeast. Like I can make hops pop a little bit more with the yeast I use. Little stuff like that. But I mean, there is so many moving parts, and it's one of those things. It's like the Brewers Association a couple of years ago put out a manual, and they've updated here lately. But in the old one, there was like that triangle. Like this is how business works. You can do things quickly, you can do things right, or you can do things cheap. And it's like a three-legged stool. But you only do two of those things at the same time. You can't do all three. And so you can do it right, which is what everyone wants. And so that one, you always have that leg. So then what it becomes is you can either do it quickly or you can do it cheaply. And so if you do it cheap, it's going to take you longer, if you do it, and so it's like a balancing game. It's like my time, is if I do it, I don't have to pay somebody else, but it's detracting from other priorities that I have around the brewery. So if something happens where like a couple of my friends who've owned breweries, like some of them do it, the way we've done it, some of them do it with a partnership, like a form of a partnership. I think that's definitely something that everyone should look at, is at least bringing someone into the fold that has if you're the brewer as an owner, someone who has like the business aspect of it, or just at least even if it's not like a business aspect, where there's something where you guys can figure that stuff out together. If there's another kind of leg out there that they can take, even if it just takes stuff off your plate, as far as dealing with, the federal government or your logging, or even if it's helping you in the back cleaning stuff. Anything that you can do, where even if it's like kind of like a sweat equity type thing, look at forming like some type of I wouldn't say cooperative, but like a partnership, and then it kind of spreads everything else out. There's always people that you kind of know that then it does help you out quite a bit, as far as like quality of life. Because I mean, like Misty and I, we've got 3 young kids, and there are days where it does get strenuous because we're doing stuff here. And then she's working up front and in her office work, and then we've got 100 things because they've got stuff going on, so it does make things a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, you got a lot of moving parts, so just to have that person there to kind of accompany and alleviate some of that stress, that's going to be valuable.
Yeah, absolutely.
She told me what she want from the jump. That's why I stay. She told me what it was from the jump. She told me what it was from the jump. She told me what she want from the jump. Walk out the room after making.
Unfortunately, that concludes the interview with Chris Roberts. We learned a lot. We laughed. We launtered. We vorlofed. We splarged. We did it all. We learned about the brewing process, the difference between ales and lagers, the main ingredients in beer, what different types of breweries there are, the different styles of beer, and the journey it takes to ultimately become an owner and brewmaster of a brewery. So go ahead and check out Red Crow Brewing Company on Facebook, or you can go to their website, redcrowbrew.com, and show your support for Misty and Chris in their endeavor to make craft beer. I've had several really good questions submitted, and I'm still currently looking for someone in the area that can adequately answer those. With that said, for next episode is about a topic that I haven't put much thought into until recently due to the COVID-19 global pandemic. Somewhat polarizing, and there's certainly a lot of different opinions about it and misinformation, but I hope that this coming episode provides a level of clarity that you wouldn't get otherwise. If you go to simplequestionspodcast.com, accompanied with each episode, there is a short summary as well as timestamps for key things talked about in the video, as well as I have also put links to some of the sources and things mentioned in each episode. And while you're there, you might as well just scroll down and submit a question that you have, or if you're a local artist and are looking to be in the intro, shoot me a DM or email. Thank you for listening, and like always, keep asking questions.
She told me from the jump, she told me from the jump, said, she told me from the jump, she told me from the jump. She told me from the jump, she told me from the